The Justice Department says we're paying too much when we swipe our debit card. This is the IssuesWatch podcast. Hi, I'm Don Meyer, Chief Marketing Officer at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and welcome to the IssuesWatch podcast. In late September, the U.S. Justice Department announced that it was suing financial services giant Visa for allegedly violating antitrust laws in its debit card business, which accounts for an estimated 60% of all debit transactions in the country. Attorney General Merrick Garland said, quote, "Visa has unlawfully amassed the power to extract fees that far exceed what it could charge in a competitive market," and added that the fees Visa charges affects not just the price of one thing, but the price of nearly everything. Here with me to discuss the lawsuit and Visa's role in the debit card space is Eric Cohen, CEO of Merchant Advocate, financial consultants that help merchants save money from the credit card industry. Merchant is also a longtime NJCPA member benefit provider. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah, I should have said welcome back, because I think this is your second time on the podcast.
Yes, it is.
Part of the Two Timers Club. All right. So let's start by, if you could, please explain Visa's role in the debit card space.
So currently, Visa owns debit networks. Okay. Some debit networks, for instance, VisaNet and Interlink, are owned by Visa, right? If we all look at the back of the credit card, on the back of your credit card, you'll see different networks: Nice, Pulse, Plus, Star. Some of those are owned by Visa. And today, there's over 60% of the debit transactions that run through a Visa network, from my understanding, and create well over $7 billion in fees.
Wow. So does Visa have competitors?
Maybe. We could call them that. I mean, Visa is the giant. Then you have MasterCard, Discover, and American Express. I think that, what's interesting about debit is debit runs on different rails. In the payments world, they talk about rails. You're running on the Visa MasterCard credit rails, or you're running on the debit rails, right? Whether it's a PIN-based debit card or a non-PIN-based or debit routing, there's all these different ways to route transactions. Visa is the giant. They own the majority of the debit transactions. The fact that they own, that large could give them a competitive advantage. Absolutely.
So why is the Justice Department suing Visa?
So from everything I've read, on this topic and everything going on, I don't think it's that they own 60% plus of the market. I think it's some of the actions that they're accusing Visa of, right? They accuse them of being monopolistic or anti-competitive type kind of quotes that are out there, and things that are, not only in the media, but the Department of Justice and how they feel Visa is approaching this. Now, just to hit on a couple topics, apparently what Visa has done with very large merchants and banks is they offer lower fees and lower rates if those banks and large merchants send transactions to the debit Visa rails. If those merchants don't hit their numbers, or if they might be exclusive, I don't think it's exclusivity on all of them, but it's majority of transactions. My understanding is Visa will then tell the bank or the merchant, you didn't hit your numbers, and you're either going to get a penalty or a higher fee. So in a contract, right? And to me, there's a question is this monopolistic or not? There's a contract that's put together with the merchant and the banks that says, here's the number we want you to hit, or here's the exclusivity type arrangement. And if you don't hit these numbers or follow, there will be a penalty. So in my eyes, that's fair business practices. I think the issue and the Department of Justice is coming down and saying, well, you're not really giving someone else a choice. You're using your power through your size to force someone's hand, right? So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be, from what I understand, what they say to their competition. And again, this is from Department of Justice. Our understanding is Visa may say to their competition, you know what, you could compete and we might go after you. We might try to throw some punitive or penalties or, potentially lawsuits. Or instead of competing, why don't you just join us and play in the same sandbox with us? Now, again, when you're the giant and you have deep, deep, deep pockets, you could do that. Do I think that's a case to be made? Absolutely. I don't think a company that is extremely large should try to buy out their competition at all times. I think a company should just be better than their competition, and that's why they have the market size.
So has Visa's response, and I'm assuming this has come up before this past September when the Justice Department announced the lawsuit, has Visa's justification always been, to use your wording, this is business practice, this is the way business is done? Has that always been sort of their rationale?
I mean, we're in a country that allows for capitalism. It allows for fair play. I believe, Visa's response would basically be, listen, this is all fair business. We are the largest. And again, this is just in my words, what I would think Visa's position is, you know what? They're not doing anything illegal in their eyes. They are just using their size and their leverage, right? I mean, think about a lot of industries. The more someone sells of a product or service, the lower the cost is, the lower the cost could be to the end user, right?
Right.
While there's a fight about these fees, I think another thing that's mentioned a lot in the media is that the increased fees actually cause merchants to increase their prices to the consumer and or give worse customer service. Now, debit card fees are the lowest. Credit card fees are a lot higher. I may agree with that comment if you're fighting credit card fees because they're the highest cost fee. Or I may agree with that comment if you are a chain of convenience stores with a lot of tickets, mostly debit cards, or you're a big box store that's out there. But for the small mom and pop or the medium-sized business, I have a hard time believing that the increased fees in debit cards, which are pennies, when I talk pennies, it's 20, 22, 23 cents, 25 cents for most regulated cards. I don't really believe in the comment that the increased debit fees are causing merchants to pass along fees to consumers or increase prices and or worse customer service. And again, I would believe that for credit cards, but I can't see that argument at all on the debit card side.
Interesting. Okay. Because that was going to be my next question. You had mentioned that if merchants didn't hit their numbers, Visa could penalize them in some way. And does that cost typically get passed along to the customer? But it sounds like, in your opinion, that you don't think it does.
Yeah, I mean, listen, going to the local pizza place, they're not even looking at it. They're looking at their entire cost of credit cards, right? Which have debit and credit in it. And those costs are high. The mid-sized company, not really looking at it. You get to like the big box stores where there's millions and millions and millions of transactions, or you look at a gas station, or you look at these convenience stores, and you look at industries that have, transactions every second, supermarkets. Okay. Yes, I could see that, right? Because that is a high cost. There's a high churn. But in the grand scheme of the merchant population, the majority of businesses are not really looking this granular and saying, oh, okay, my debit card cost is, 30 cents instead of 23 cents or 27 cents. I'm going to have to pass along another 2 pennies to the consumer.
Okay.
They're looking at everything else. I mean, let's face it. They're looking at inflation. They're looking at the price in food, and restaurants are looking at those costs and everything else. A lot of them are not granularly looking at the debit card cost.
So if Visa's saying, if Visa's saying on one hand, this is kind of a standard business practice, and you don't have consumers or merchants screaming from the rooftops about how unfair this is. And I'm thinking of Ticketmaster and like concert tickets and things like that, and how people complain about the fact that Ticketmaster owns that particular market. If you don't have that situation, what does the Justice Department hope to accomplish? And what are some of the potential outcomes of the lawsuit?
I mean, ultimately, the Justice Department has really been pushing on Visa, MasterCard, right? For a long time. I think there's a lot of lobbyists on both sides. I think that you have organizations, whether it's convenience store or supermarket organizations, that are pushing on this, right? You have both sides pushing. One saying we're okay, one saying, you know what, this is driving up costs. There is a large focus in this country on junk fees, large focus. When you have a credit card and you're paying 32% interest, that's a problem, right? When you go into an auto dealer and the price is not really the price sometimes, or, you go into a store and they're trying to pass the fee of accepting credit cards, but they're not disclosing it right. And all these other junk fees that we all pay. I think this is being wrapped into junk fees. Okay. And do I think it's the place for it? No, but I think there's a lot of attention on it. Ultimately, I would think the Department of Justice is trying to allow more competition to come in, right? And there's competition coming in. There's different forms of payments. I believe we're going to see peer-to-peer payments increase, right? We've all seen, some of the companies that allow peer-to-peer payments. I think ultimately there'll be a lot more business peer-to-peer type payments coming in and direct funds and, those type environments. Is it expensive for the competition? Yes. Is there going to be one or two leaders? In my opinion, there will be, and those leaders will then, be able to combat Visa, maybe not at the scale of Visa, but they'll take a portion of these payments away, right? But I think if the Department of Justice pushes on this and it goes to, trial or it goes to some sort of settlement, it's ultimately how do you decrease the costs of acceptance and let competition come in. Now, there's a number of different things today in Congress. There's a Credit Card Competition Act, allowing more networks on the back of a card. There's also the Durbin Act, I believe, which was part of an amendment years and years ago that limited the cost of debit cards, right? It regulated the cost of debit cards for large banks. There's now a push to bring that from 21 and 22 cents down to 15 cents, okay? Which would affect not the debit rails, but it would affect ultimately the credit rails and the pricing, which will then, in my mind, ultimately affect the pricing on the debit rails. So I think that there's a number of initiatives today from different directions, all coming after Visa, MasterCard, maybe. I don't know where MasterCard sits in this, right? Ultimately, with the idea of can they reduce the cost of accepting payment in this country?
So if you were betting, what would you say is the outcome of this lawsuit?
Well, the first bet is the timing of the outcome. And I don't think it's going to be anything soon. 5+ years, maybe.
Wow.
This thing will go back and forth, back and forth. I mean, one way it'll go, there's more regulation, apparently, in everyone's mind. One way will go less regulation. However, I think there's a lot of other things going on that need attention before the cost of accepting credit cards. As you know, there has been a class action from Visa and MasterCard that was settled years and years ago. The class is still open. I mean, we're talking years of back and forth with attorneys and, courts and settlement advisors. So anything around something of this size and magnitude, my first bet is nothing's happening for the next 4 to 5 years. There might be a lot of activity, but no settlement. Ultimately, do I think that the cost of debit cards and interchange on it will go down at some point from where it is today? Yeah, it should. In order to move money, there's a lot less risk in a debit card than a credit card. In order to move money from point A to B, does it really cost the current rate of interchange, which is again 21 or 22 cents on most debit cards? Do I think that should go down? Yes. Do I think that it's this case alone? No, I think it's a combination of what's happening here, along with everything else that's going to be in the Senate and Congress with all Visa, MasterCard, that together cumulatively may make a difference. Okay. Now, ultimately, the question is, does it get to the businesses or who keeps these reductions? Right. Are the processors going to continue to mark up the fees and keep some of these reductions? Possibly. There are ways to do that. But again, I said before, I think the big box stores, the supermarkets, the small tickets with tons of transactions, I think they'll ultimately get some relief. Do I think that relief will be passed to the consumer? No. That relief will stay with The business owner.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, as usual, no relief for the consumer. But we'll have to have you back in 5 years, and we can see if your prediction was accurate, which I have a feeling it probably will be. So thanks again, Eric, for joining us today. We always appreciate your perspective on the credit card and the debit industry.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Don.
Thanks for listening and watching. To learn more about Merchant Advocate and the services they provide to NJCPA members, visit marketplace.njcpa.org.